Welcome to Mean Age Daydream with me, Brian McWilliams, where we're going to be making some jokes, laughing out at broken world, but also laying out some philosophy for the future, how we can fix this mess we're in and have a great time doing it all with a Mean Age Daydream. Hello, what's up, Buttercups? Welcome to Mean Age Daydream. I am here, of course, your beautiful bald host, Brian McWilliams, and I have two guests today who I'm very happy to have on the show, writing about a vitally important topic and bringing with it some humor. They are Abby Hall and Chris Coyne, who are the authors of How to Run Wars, which is a new book, a confidential handbook for the national security elite. Ladies, gentlemen, welcome to the show. How are you guys doing?
Very good, Brian. Thank you for having us.
Yes, thank you so much.
Yeah, well, I'm glad we could make it. I know we had to reschedule a few times. We've got Abby. We're recording this about a week before it's going to air. Abby is battening down the hatches against the hurricane in Florida. So if she cuts out midterm, we know what's happened, and we will pray for your safe return. But that's what you're saying. It's touch and go.
It's a little touch and go. I think this might be the Batman origin story of Florida man being trapped in your house with your children during a hurricane.
We can only hope. Do you have some alligator repellent in case it floods and they're coming in the back doors, anything like that?
Other than just like a stern talking to, not really.
I would have at least one shotgun, I think, just for alligator purposes. Well, let's give the people a little bit of a background on you guys. So Chris is a senior fellow at the Independent Institute, which also published the book, the co-editor of the Independent Review, a professor of economics at George Mason University, associate director of the F.A. Hayek Program for Advanced Study in Philosophy, Politics, and Economics at the Mercatus Center, and co-editor of the Review of Austrian Economics. That is all fantastic stuff. And Abby is a senior fellow also at the Independent Institute and an associate professor of economics at the University of Tampa Bay. So you guys have got some heft behind you. You've got some good credentials so that people know you're not just pulling these things out of, thin air or out of whatever bodily cavities you happen to own. I just want to say, straight off, I love the idea of the book. I love bringing in a satirical take, because as somebody that does stand-up comedy in my offsides and kind of, I've dabbled in my own screenwriting and sketch comedy, there is so much to be done with satire in breaking through a lot of the barriers that exist when it comes to topics like this where people are so brainwashed. So I'd love to hear a little bit about the genesis of this book, How to Run Wars. What was the inspiration that made you guys take this tact? And, was there anything specifically that you went, let's do something like that? Did something stick in the back of your mind where you thought this was going to be the perfect approach?
Yeah. Well, Abby and I have worked together now for a long time on these issues, on issues of war, on issues of how war abroad affects liberties at home and so on. So we had the intellectual background. Most of those studies were pure, straight up, ordinary academic works. And we're both fans of Mark Twain. We used Mark Twain to motivate one of our earlier books. He, of course, was a very staunch anti-imperialist. So there was that influence. But we came across a book by the name of How to Run a War by an economist named Bruce Winton Knight, which was published in the 30s. And very few people know about this book. I didn't until someone brought it up to me. And when I read it, I just fell in love with it. And he writes it in a satirical manner. So this is in the 30s he's writing. And I told Abby about it. She read it. And we just both kind of came together and said, it would be wonderful to take this style of writing, which, you don't see a lot of anymore of satirical writing in
No, you don't.
Popular press, certainly by academics, you don't. And to take a quite a serious topic and to kind of merge the two. But what we tried to do in the book is for all the various examples, which we think are absurd, they're actually all real world examples. We're able to reference concrete real world US government policymakers doing stuff that kind of, the book wrote itself, I have to say. Abby, I think this is the fastest book we've ever written.
Yes, that is without a doubt the case.
Yeah, it was a blast. So maybe you want to say something else, Abby, in addition to that.
No, I mean that really covers it. But I'm with Chris. There's something about using satire within this realm that I think is important, because on the one hand, I think for people who are inclined to our point of view in terms of foreign policy, it provides kind of just another layer of, hey, this is, this is absurd. But what I've told people when I've presented the work elsewhere is that even if they don't buy exactly what it is that we're selling, even if the satire serves its purpose in a very small way, and that it uses humor, oftentimes very dark humor, to make people think about the topic more critically, then that's a way I think that makes the material and the ideas more accessible than if it's written in another style.
Yeah, yeah, I would agree. It is kind of interesting now when you put it in that way. I think particularly you're right. It makes people really think deeper because when it comes to satire, you do have to say you have to add an additional layer of are these people trying to con me? Are they trying to make a joke here? Or are they just simply laying out the facts? And as you mentioned earlier, so much of this. And you've got fantastic quotes throughout the book, by the way, which I really appreciated. Like you said, it kind of does. I can see how it kind of would have written itself in a way because there's just so much. I mean, the depth of material you have, as far as just the amount of, hypocrisy, screw ups, and one of my favorite chapters, and we'll go through the playbook, but one of my favorite chapters is, do not accept failure. Because my God, it's just how many times can you fail again and again and then go back to the well and do the exact same thing? But you'd mentioned this was one of the fastest books you've ever written. And I could feel that and notice that because it's so unbelievably timely. And granted, I know we just passed the year mark in the Ukraine war, or our proxy war, however you want to look at it. But I did notice, starting off referencing the Ukraine war as really a kind of jumping off point for the beginning of the book was just, it hits hard because we're just right in the midst of it. So do you want to talk a little bit about that? Was the Ukraine war another kind of impetus to push this book forward and get it out quickly?
Well, I think that, again, since we've been working on this so long together, we had the general framing of what we wanted to do. So from that standpoint, it made it easier. But, to your point, not just Ukraine, but to your earlier point about the never admit failure, I have to say that the U.S. government, in a very sad way, is good for business for those of us who are in the business of analyzing foreign policy, because it is literally one jumping pad to the next. And even if you just think about it, right, in the context of Ukraine and Russia, that you get the debacle that is the Afghanistan withdrawal, both the occupation for decades and then the withdrawal. And you think to yourself, okay, this is it. Like, people are going to step back and say, this is so terrible. We really actually need to rethink whether the endeavor itself with the US government intervening all around the world, whether this actually makes sense. And maybe there was some self-reflection for a day or two, if that. But then all of a sudden, now we got to intervene over here again. And so it's this continuous cycle that is kind of depressing in a way, but also makes it really important, I think, to kind of pull back the curtain on what's involved. And as Abby said, the purpose of the book is not to offer some grand blueprint for fixing the world. Just the opposite in some sense. It's that you can't fix the world, even though that's the claims people make. But to pull back the curtain on what war making, on what empire really entails and involves, and to have people take a really hard look at that.
Yeah. Well, I thought there was a great quote. We're talking about how we're pivoting from war to war to war and how there's not really a time for reflection. One of the quotes that I'd written down that you include in the book is one from James Madison, of course, that, keeping your freedom, keeping your liberty is virtually impossible in a state of constant warfare, something that I think we all probably agree is by design. But also that we get into this concept of good and evil and how we are constantly being propagandized. And you can look at the Ukraine war as a perfect example of it, as is the war on terror, good versus evil, and how this is used as a lever to get people's minds to not examine the overall good of war in general, of the brutality, as you say, and inhumanity of war, and to stop people from thinking about whether or not this is actually becoming effective. Because whether it's effective or not, if we're in a battle versus good and evil, how can we not take part in it, right?
Yeah, and there's definitely a major element of that. And Chris and I have written extensively, not only there's examples in this book, but in one of our prior works together, we've written extensively on the kind of the messaging and the propaganda element surrounding US foreign policy. And you're absolutely right that the framing here is one that's critical. And so you're right, when you collapse something into good and evil, it removes any ability for or any room for gray area. And the reality is, for pretty much any policy we want to talk about, we're living in a gray area. And that black and white distinction, though, is one that makes it really, quote unquote, easy for people to understand, where it's we're on this side, they're on that side. So you're either with us or you're against us. You are for the policy, you're patriotic, and you're a supportive American, or you're not. And so it's a really effective way to collapse kind of those more critical discussions about foreign policy. But we said we've discussed this in a lot of places, and the reason we motivate the book first with control the narrative is because that narrative distinction is so critically important.
Yeah. Well, let's talk a little bit more. Let's break down some of these chapters, because you've got 10 chapters, I believe, in the book. And I was going through them all, and it's, I don't want to have you run through each chapter. That seems like it'd be a little bit time consuming. I'll read them off real quickly, and then I want you to kind of highlight some of the ones that, granted, they're all important, but some of your favorite chapters, I guess, some of your favorite roles, because you started off, first it's a call to arms, but then you get into the playbook. And as you mentioned, you start with control the narrative. Then it goes to capture the media, prepare the sacrifices, sacrifice liberty in the name of liberty, embrace top-down economic planning. Greatly enjoyed that one. Although I think it was interesting in the top-down economic planning, you talk about the Defense Production Act and some of these other acts that were put into place to control the economy during wartime. But one that popped into my mind that isn't necessarily wartime associated, but still is kind of an economic factor as far as guiding our companies, is the Import-Export Bank, which I despise. And I just kind of, I don't know, it just triggered me thinking about it. You talk about loosening the purse strings, silencing dissent, ignoring international law, and then chapter 10, do not accept failure, and then finish off with running wars. So which of these in particular did you have? I'll ask two questions, two prongs. Which one did you have the most fun writing, and which one was the most painful to write just because you're shaking your head the whole time at the absurdity and the depravity of the environment we live in?
Abby, would you like to go first so you can pick your favorite before I do?
I mean, kind of, but I also want to know how you'd answer this question.
All right. Go ahead. You go ahead.
So I think for me, it's really hard for me to say like a favorite chapter. I'll say the one that I think the satire is the one that I think is the most like pointedly crafted is ignore international law, because it's so biting and pointed. But I really like that chapter because I think it conveys the message that we're trying to send really well and really highlights the cost. And so in terms of which one was the most fun to write, I don't know that I could pick one that was fun, kind of rank order. But I will say this was probably one of the greatest delights in pulling quotes and things where just going, I can't believe Henry Kissinger said this on record that we can now quote it in its entirety. And so
I just want to, sorry to interrupt you. I really want to emphasize that. That was something I really, really enjoyed in the book. I mean, the quotes in it, it's so much, as you said, it's so much absurdity, and you laugh at it, and you use them so well to provide the point. And this book is written, of course, as a guide to other people within the war state. This is the elite. This is the top secret manual. But the quotes provided so much insofar as usefulness that people can pull these things to debunk, other arguments online, to point to the absurdities online, to point to the hypocrisies when having arguments with other people. I don't know if anybody will listen to them, as we've seen in our environment, but I really, really was impressed with the quotations you guys had. I thought you did just an absolutely fantastic job.
Well, thank you. So I think for me, that was definitely the most fun part, was seeing how we were going to weave kind of some of these quotes together to show that, no, we're not just saying this. Other people have been saying this too in relevant positions.
Yeah, and on the quotes, thank you for the kind words. Let me also mention we were very careful. Again, this emerges on its own, so it's not like we had to try. They're bipartisan, and so it's not like just picking on Republicans or Democrats. Through time, you see both sides, and that's one of the things we wanted to pull back. The war making enterprise is not a Democrat or Republican issue. It is an issue with the state itself. In terms of my favorites, I'm going to pick to start chapter 4, which is Prepare the Sacrifices. And I got to give my co-author kudos for and props for this one. The opening line I just love, even though, again, I think it's dark humor. But you're all familiar with the maxim, you've got to break some eggs to make an omelet. And then we go on to say, war making is like the omelet of freedom, I think we call it at one point. But the eggs here, of course, are human skulls. And that's the prepare the sacrifice. It again is a very jarring thing once you step back and think about it. And this goes back to your point earlier, Brian, about the good and the bad. War making is the most vulgar kind of collectivism writ large. It's not just good and bad. It is homogenizing millions and millions of people into those categories. And it alleviates any individual because it's the nation acting on another nation, which is bad. So it alleviates any individual responsibility, and it empowers people to do the worst things imaginable to other human beings, because after all, they're bad and they're all the same. So there's no individualism anymore. There is no dignity at the individual level. It's this simple aggregate, which is why I call it the most vulgar form of collectivism one can imagine. So I very much like the Prepare the Sacrifice chapter. In terms of my favorite to write, it is the conclusion, Running Wars, because it is we begin by returning to addressing the national security elite and telling them how important they are, and then telling them how they have to keep this guide out of the hands of the ordinary, the hands of the ordinary incompetent citizens. Because if they let the citizens have access to the guide, and this is, of course, where we try to pull back the curtain on the satire, if people haven't picked it up already, that they're going to realize all of the horribleness that's involved in war, that the national security elite can't actually do what they say they want to do about controlling the world, that there's an inherent tension between their grand claims about freedom and liberty and democracy and what they're actually doing, and how this is a perpetual cycle of violence. Where the way we put it in the book is there's constant tripwires, that you do one thing and then you just set up another tripwire over here and it's going to get set off, and that justifies interventions over there, and it's never ending. Yeah. And how there's alternatives to this, that it's not the only way that we can imagine running a society that we live in, and how we imagine interacting with other human beings. And so I really personally enjoyed working on that chapter, just because it let us lay out this alternative vision of the world that's not grounded in violence and war making towards our fellow human beings.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it was, and I want to say this about the book in general. It was, I like the culminating chapter a lot. I was amazed at how it's a very quick read. I'll say that. I don't mean that the book's short by saying that. I mean, it reads very well. You get through it quickly because you're interested in hearing what you have to say. And again, the quotes really help to kind of break it up and move you along. Going back a little bit to what you're talking about as far as the sacrificial lambs, I found a lot of interest in that chapter. In particular, there was one thing that stood out to me that I didn't realize. You guys talk about the ROTC programs in the United States. And this is something that just, I never heard it before, but the amount of programs that exist, the way that they funnel children into them, the way that they're funded, the way that they're actually affecting budgets of schools because they're paying for the instructors. So if you don't mind, just give me a little tidbit on that, because I thought that was something that really stood out to me as fascinating, that I don't think hardly anybody, unless maybe people that are in ROTC, I would ever was, might know, but I think most of my audience is probably not aware of this.
Sure. And to be clear, there were actually a lot of things, and this is something that has been true, I know, kind of throughout the work that Chris and I have done together, of things that when researching we'll stumble upon and we had no idea about it beforehand either. And this was actually one. Of course, I was familiar, and Chris was familiar as well, with the ROTC. But there was an article that was published, I might be mistaken, but I think it was in the New York Times a couple of years ago, that had found that high school students were being automatically enrolled in ROTC programs, even when they hadn't registered for them. And that for many of these students, they were having difficulty unenrolling from them, even if they said explicitly that they did not want to participate. And so within that, you know, might be wondering, well, why are they being enrolled? And so there's all of the financial implications that you mentioned a moment ago. The military is supplying the instructors for the course. They're supplementing that pay. It winds up being a budgetary win for schools that may not have a lot of resources. But then you start thinking about, well, what's the purpose? What's the military getting out of it? And so this is one of those cases where I think the quotes were really important, where we have quotes from not only students who've been in these ROTC programs, but also from people within the military branches talking about the efficacy of these programs, of saying, look, if even, only like a quarter of them decide to enlist, that's still a really big win for us. And then the rest of them are exposed to these ideas of, the military and its culture, and they're going to be more sympathetic to it. And that was yet another, I think, one of those examples that was really eye-opening and quite surprising.
Yep. It was fascinating to me. And you guys did, it's funny, just as I was reading the book too, we're in the middle of the NFL season, and you do a good job of talking about also how, the propagandization of so much of America, the amount of money the military spends on all of these, major sports. And I did get a chuckle. There was one line, it did crack me up because it was talking about it. And the government doesn't just spend on popular sports; it spends on crap nobody watches. You don't want to talk about expenditures in like Major League Soccer and the Professional Bull Riders Association or the Professional Bull Riding League, and I guess tying into the Border Patrol, right? I think that's what it was. Yes, it was a very, very interesting read.
Well, if we made a comedian chuckle, then we'll take.
Yeah, it was.
We've done our job.
Yeah, no, it was good. It just check my head. I was like, yeah, that's funny. I thought there was an interesting use, and this was one. Even I had to stop and pause for a minute and say, wait a minute, this is a direct quote, but it's interesting because I'm trying to figure out the direct quote and the use of satire because it was very well done. You were talking about the premise of how the empire building has to go forward. We're doing this for a great cause. This is for freedom. And even the founding fathers, which of course, we think of the founding fathers, they wanted a limited empire, and they don't get involved in foreign entanglements. But you had a very interesting quote in there, and it was from Jefferson, used to support the building of empire in the context of this book, which I wanted you guys just to talk about briefly. And it was a quote from Jefferson talking about how, well, we should plant a flag to the north, aka now what is Canada, and expand, I guess, the Empire of Liberty as far as the eye could see. Something along those lines. I'm messing up the direct quote, but it was when I read it a few times, because I was like, that's a really interesting pull to use this quote to support the satirical emphasis of the book and make it sound like Jefferson is also for us continuously expanding the U.S. empire. So,
yeah, it's interesting with the founders because there's certainly tensions amongst them. And foreign policy is one area you see it. You're right. It's planting a flag, I think, in Canada and then in Cuba.
In Cuba.
Jefferson talks about as well. And look, I mean, if you just think about U.S. history, which of course is long and nuanced, but there's westward expansion, and then there's expansion outside the borders, and then post World War II, you get expansion beyond the Western Hemisphere to be the world's police, and so it's not always a clean and linear march, but you certainly see a linear move to further and further expansion. And the tension, I think, is on the one hand, you have these people, you have George Washington, you have Adams, Jefferson, where at points they recognize the concerns. They recognize the concern of empowering government, of destroying the very liberties that they purport to uphold, of bankrupting the country, of doing harm to other people. But at these other moments, they kind of say these things where it's like, yeah, but we need to have this westward expansion. Mm-hmm. And so maybe that's a warning. Maybe that's a warning to be wary of government policymakers, even those that seem to be suggesting that they recognize the limitations of government, because even for these people that are oftentimes held up as being kind of the defenders of fundamental freedoms and liberties of the country, of recognizing the importance of limited government, even they were tempted to quickly move beyond the bounds. So imagine present day policymakers who lack any kind of commitment to those values and ethical precepts in the first place. To my way of thinking, they're going to be even more likely to be tempted to expand the scale and scope of their power over people domestically and internationally.
Yeah, I was mad when they started renaming the Jefferson schools and all that. Now, I don't know. Maybe I'm for it. Rename all the schools. Abby, anything you want to add on that point?
No, I think that Chris is really, on the nose, which hopefully I'd agree with him. There's really just this like siren song when it comes to foreign intervention. And I think that the tension that Chris mentioned is really important, especially when we start to think about this broader idea of we have to export liberty in order to preserve liberty. Mm-hmm. And this fundamental, I think tension is the right word, but there's something inherently liberal about imposing liberal institutions under the direct threat or under the conditions of active violence. And so one of the things that we're hopeful that this book will do is not only highlight those tensions, and we do so very explicitly in one part of the book, talk about kind of the supposed trade-off between liberty and security compared to an alternative way of thinking about government expansions, as a result of war, preparation for war, and foreign policy, but also throughout, as Chris mentioned earlier, get people to really understand that, hey, even if you do think that this is freedom expanding or freedom preserving, there's a lot of cost that you have likely not considered that go along with this type of foreign policy, and really highlighting what exactly is required in order to maintain or to continue historical and contemporary U.S. foreign policy. And with the Jefferson quote specifically is that the policy phenomenon that we're seeing, there's definitely a major expansion, of course, in U.S. foreign policy, World War II and after World War II. But the types of expansions that we're talking about, or the interventions that we're talking about, are in no way novel or contained to that period. So if you look back at the U.S. war with Mexico, the Spanish-American War, and a variety of other conflicts in which the U.S. was involved, this is not a contemporary phenomenon, which I think also tells us something important, that it's historical, but also remarkably contemporary. Again, is one of those reasons why the examples that we use span a lot of history, contemporary and antiquated.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, let's go towards our contemporary with the contemporary question here. I'm just curious, both of you are obviously in academia. I'm curious as to how you are, regarded on your campuses. Are you at odds with people in the most part on your campuses? Are you, do you find you have allies? Because I don't know how, the University of Tampa, I don't know the culture there. I've never been to George Mason University either. So I don't know. Are you guys persona non gratas for not supporting the war state? Are you pegged with tomatoes at the Ukraine and Palestinian rallies and all this stuff?
Well, let me say this. I'm very fortunate in that I have the space in the Department of Economics and in the F.A. Hayek program at George Mason to be myself, to speak my mind. So from that standpoint, I'm quite grateful. Interestingly, and this is not just on campus, but intellectually in general, here's what I'll say. Economically, so if I was talking, put aside foreign policy, if I was just talking economics, I would be considered a major outlier on George Mason's campus, given my views on economics, economic freedom, and so on. But the most contentious settings I have been in when it comes to matters of foreign policy is often kind of settings where it is more conservative ideologically. And part of what, not the only thing that motivates Abby and I, but part of what motivates our work together, I would say, is trying to realize or make other people realize the same things that you are worried about with government when it comes to control of economic activity domestically, internationally, that exists in spades when it comes to foreign policy, which is why we have that chapter in the book, of course, on top-down state planning and you should embrace it. And so from that standpoint, it's been interesting because in front of those audiences, if I was talking about economic matters, again, purely, narrowly economic freedom, I probably would have been celebrated, but pushing back against the warfare state is quite difficult. And so, Abby, I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about your experience.
Sure, and it's going to sound really similar. In my department at the University of Tampa, I've been remarkably supported by my colleagues in pursuing whatever it is that I want to pursue intellectually, and the broader college that I'm in, the Sykes College of Business, has also been really supportive in me researching those things that I am passionate about and probing these types of questions. Like Chris, I think I'm also a statistical outlier as far as economists go in terms of how I think about things like not only war and foreign policy, but also, as Chris mentioned, things like individual and economic freedom. It has been really interesting to me as well to see which audiences are more receptive to our work and which are more hostile. My experience has been similar to Chris's in that when I've presented these types of arguments to people who are more conservative, that's where I tend to see the majority of the pushback for the exact same reasons I think that Chris mentioned. And in fact, I gave a talk several months ago to such a group, and I said, I have a feeling I'm about to be very popular and very unpopular at the same time, because I started with arguments related to things like, financial policy, top-down economic planning, and then highlighted those same problems within the context of U.S. foreign policy, and the entire mood in the room just completely shifted. Surprisingly, though, and this I want to say because I feel like it maybe provides a positive note, I've actually had the opportunity to present our work to two separate militaries, officers in the U.S. Military and then officers in the Guatemalan military. And I find that people who are active in U.S. foreign policy and people who are veterans actually tend to really, the work that we do tends to resonate with them because they've seen the machine in action and they understand it. And I know that the first time I ever had a large contingent military audience thinking that it was going to go very poorly, and I was pleasantly surprised.
See, this is why, people, I, for one, am not a fan of the select service or the draft, but maybe we need to bring back a big draft. We'll get everybody in the military. Then they'll come around to this way of thinking like, this sucks. What is this garbage? We just got to give them a taste. It's always interesting to me to hear that because as of late, it's like people always ask what happened to the anti-war left. Right. And I thought that conservatives were coming around more, but it's disappointing for me to hear that it's still not really getting through to a lot of people, with some exceptions, as you said. So that's too bad. But what are you going to do? That's why we fight the fight, right?
Yeah, and I should say one final thing I should say, since they published the book, the Independent Institute and think tanks like that organization are quite important as well, because they give us the space to say these things and publish them and make them available at an affordable price, which oftentimes academic books are not. So they deserve a lot of credit as well for helping create space to have these intellectual conversations.
Yeah, Independent
Absolutely.
was wonderful. When we approached them with the idea of doing satire, not only did they not immediately say no, but they were really, really excited about it, which helped us to kind of continue to be really excited about the work as we were writing it and then as we were going through the editing process.
Absolutely. Well, as you mentioned, it is a book that is a huge outlier, and I can't think of, I really can't think of any books that are written satirically, especially at a topic that's serious. You just don't see it anymore, and it used to be fairly common. So, yeah, great job, guys. I really appreciate it. For all the listeners out there, I will put a link to buy the book in the show notes. I will also, I'll make sure I get your socials so that I can include those as well. But just as a wrap up, where should people follow you? Where can they find you and read more about your writings or your hot takes of the day?
Well, we both have professional websites. Mine is ccoyne.com. So 2 C's, OYNE.com, or Google Chris Coyne GMU and it will come up.
Yeah, same thing for me. If you Google my name, Abigail Hall or Abigail Blanco is the other name at the University of Tampa, I'll pop up. People can, of course, find both of us on the Independent Institute's website. So both of us have pages there. And then my personal website, which also has a contact option, is abigailrhall.com.
All right. Well, thank you both very much. Love the work. Love the book. Again, that book is How to Run Wars, a confidential playbook for the national security elite. I appreciate the time. I appreciate the writing skills, and I hope that this book goes blockbuster. And Abby, I hope that you're still around by the time this episode airs.
Me too.
Me three. Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you guys again.
Brian.
Yep. I look forward to the next book.
Thanks so much.